The coffee cups and the clock. The scent of burnt coffee, sharp and acrid, was the first hook that morning. It snagged Sarah in the doorway of her mother's cozy kitchen, freezing her mid-step. Eleanor always made perfect coffee. Strong, yes, but smooth, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. Now, the metallic tang hung heavy, a discordant note in the familiar symphony of home, the ticking regulator clock over the stove, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor insisted on calling the icebox, the faint scent of lavender polish clinging to the old oak table. "Mom!" Sarah called, her voice tight. Silence. Then, a clatter. She found Eleanor standing by the sink, staring blankly at the overflowing coffee pot, dark liquid creeping across the counter like an invading stain. The glass carafe sat empty beside the brewer, forgotten. Eleanor's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the counter. Her face, usually animated with warmth or gentle exasperation, was slack, bewildered. Lost. This isn't just forgetfulness. The chilling realization sank its second hook deep into Sarah's chest. This is different. This is erosion. "Mom, the pot," Sarah said gently, moving swiftly. She grabbed towels, mopping the spill before it reached the electrical socket. "You forgot the carafe." Eleanor blinked, her gaze slowly focusing on Sarah, then the mess. Confusion warred with a dawning horror in her pale blue eyes that had always held the sharp glint of intelligence and dry wit. I was making coffee," she stated, a tremor in her voice. It got away from me." Sarah forced a smile, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Happens to the best of us. Let's start over, yeah? I'll do it this time." She took her mother's cold hand, leading her to a chair at the familiar oak table. Eleanor sat down heavily, her shoulders slumped. She looked down at her hands, twisting the simple gold wedding band she still wore, even 5 years after Dad was gone. "I used to make the best coffee," she murmured, the words thick with a grief Sarah recognized instantly. It wasn't just for the coffee. The official diagnosis, early-onset Alzheimer's, arrived a month later, a clinical pronouncement that landed like a death sentence delivered in slow, agonizing motion. Dr. Evans spoke gently about plaques and tangles, cognitive decline, managing expectations. Sarah heard only the ticking clock, loud and relentless, counting down the moments until the vibrant, fiercely independent woman she called Mom would be gone, while still physically here. Saying goodbye before goodbye began that very day, not with grand gestures, but in the quiet shattering of 1,000 tiny certainties. The first goodbye was to the future. The travel brochures for the Italian lakes Eleanor had saved for years, dreaming of retracing her honeymoon steps, were quietly tucked away in a drawer. Sarah replaced them with pamphlets for local gardens, easy walks, accessible while Eleanor could still manage them. The unspoken cancellation of shared tomorrows was a constant ache. The next goodbye was to ease. Sarah moved in. Her own life, a demanding graphic design job, a nascent relationship with Ben that suddenly felt frivolous, the small independence of her city apartment, shrunk to the periphery. Her world narrowed to the 4 walls of her childhood home, now overlaid with the shadow of the disease. She became a detective of disappearing memories, a guardian against confusion, a nurse administering pills that felt like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. One crisp autumn afternoon, the third hook snagged Sarah with brutal force. They were sorting old photos, a task Sarah hoped would spark some joy. Eleanor pointed to a picture of Sarah, aged 10, grinning wildly on a swing. "Such a lovely little girl," Eleanor said softly, tracing the image with a finger. "Whose child is she?" The air left Sarah's lungs. "Whose child is she?" The words echoed, hollow and devastating. The woman who had sung her lullabies, bandaged scraped knees, fiercely defended her teenage choices, who knew the very texture of her soul, didn't recognize her own daughter. She's yours, Mom," Sarah managed, her voice cracking. "That's me. Sarah." Eleanor peered at the photo, then at Sarah, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. A flicker of something, recognition, connection, passed through her eyes, then vanished like smoke. Sarah, she repeated, testing the name. Pretty name. She smiled vaguely and turned the page, pointing to a picture of a long-deceased family dog. Now, that was a good dog. Sarah excused herself to the bathroom, locking the door. She leaned her forehead against the cool tile, the silent sobs racking her body. This was the goodbye she dreaded most, the goodbye to being known. To being seen, truly seen, by the person who had always been her anchor. The grief wasn't just for the mother she was losing, but for the daughter who was becoming a stranger in her mother's eyes. The disease was a thief, stealing moments with cruel randomness. One day, Eleanor could recite half a Shakespeare sonnet she'd learned in high school, her voice strong and clear. The next, she couldn't remember how to work the television remote, staring at it like an alien artifact. Sarah learned to navigate the shifting landscape of her mother's mind. She learned patience that scraped her nerves raw. She learned to find joy in fleeting moments of lucidity, precious islands in the rising sea of confusion. One such island appeared on a bleak November afternoon. Rain lashed against the windows. Eleanor had been restless, agitated, pacing the living room, muttering about needing to catch a train that didn't exist. Sarah had tried distraction, music, a familiar movie. Nothing worked. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. Then, almost by accident, she started humming an old folk song, one her mother used to sing while baking bread on Sunday mornings. Eleanor stopped pacing. She tilted her head, listening. Slowly, a smile, genuine and warm, touched her lips. She walked over to Sarah and sat beside her on the sofa. Without a word, she took Sarah's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. And then, she began to sing. Not the words, not anymore, but the melody. Clear and true. A haunting, wordless rendition of Shenandoah. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, unchecked. This wasn't the articulate, witty Eleanor. This was something deeper, older. A core self, perhaps, untouched by the tangles and plaques. A connection that bypassed language and memory, flowing directly from soul to soul. In that moment, holding her mother's hand, listening to the pure, aching beauty of the melody. But the disease was relentless. The islands of lucidity grew smaller, farther apart. Eleanor forgot Ben's name, then Sarah's more frequently. She became prone to sudden, tearful outbursts or bouts of suspicion, accusing Sarah of stealing her things she'd hidden herself. Sarah learned the exhausting vocabulary of caregiving, incontinence pads, sleep disturbances, sundowning, the constant vigilance against falls. The hardest goodbye was yet to come. It wasn't to memory or independence, but to safety. Eleanor began wandering. A neighbor found her in her nightgown on the porch at 3 a.m., convinced she needed to get to the elementary school to pick up the children, Sarah and her brother, decades grown. Another time, Sarah woke to find the front door wide open, the cold night air swirling in. Panic, pure and icy, seized her. She found Eleanor halfway down the block, barefoot, confused, shivering. The decision felt like a physical amputation. The lovely, sun-drenched assisted living facility, Maple Grove, felt like a betrayal. Sarah spent weeks researching, touring, crying. Eleanor, in a rare moment of clarity, looked at her during one visit. "It's nice," she said quietly. "But it's not home, is it?" The fourth hook, barbed and cruel, the knowledge that she was choosing to remove her mother from the home she loved, even as that mother was losing the capacity to understand what home meant. Moving day was a silent horror. Eleanor became agitated, clinging to the doorframe of her bedroom. "No. This is mine. You can't make me." Her cries tore at Sarah's resolve. The guilt was a suffocating blanket. Am I giving up? Am I failing her? But the memory of the open door, the cold night, the terrifying vulnerability, steeled her. This wasn't surrender, it was a desperate act of love, a final, agonizing goodbye to the illusion that she could keep Eleanor safe within the crumbling walls of her fading mind. The first few weeks at Maple Grove were brutal. Eleanor was angry, withdrawn. Sarah visited daily, each visit a minefield of potential triggers. She learned to leave her expectations at the door. Some days, Eleanor was vacant, staring out the window. Others, she was childlike, fascinated by a bird feeder or the pattern of sunlight on the floor. Rarely, a flicker of the old Eleanor surfaced. One rainy Tuesday, Sarah arrived to find her mother sitting by the large window in the common area, unusually calm. She was holding a framed photograph Sarah had brought, a picture of Eleanor and Sarah's father, young and laughing on a beach, decades ago. Eleanor traced her husband's face with a trembling finger. "He was a good man," she said softly, her voice distant but clear. "So handsome. Made me laugh." She looked up at Sarah, her eyes surprisingly focused. "He loved you very much, you know. Always said you had my spirit." Sarah held her breath. "He did, Mom. He really did." Eleanor nodded, looking back at the photo. A single tear tracked down her wrinkled cheek. "It's hard," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's all so far away now. Like trying to hold water." She looked directly at Sarah, a profound sadness in her gaze. "But you're here. You're kind." It wasn't recognition, not by name. It wasn't a declaration of maternal love. But it was an acknowledgement. An awareness of presence, of care. It was a goodbye to the past, spoken with heartbreaking clarity, and a fragile connection offered in the desolate landscape of the present. Sarah reached out and covered her mother's hand with her own. "I am here, Mom. Always." The goodbye before goodbye wasn't a single event, but a mosaic crafted from 1,000 shattered moments. It was in the coffee cups Sarah still meticulously prepared every morning during her visits, even when Eleanor forgot to drink it, because the ritual remained a thread of normalcy. It was in reading aloud Eleanor's favorite poetry collections, the rhythmic words a comfort even if their meaning was lost. It was in the gentle touch as she helped her mother into bed, the quiet humming of Shenandoah when agitation flared, the disease progressed. The woman who had taught Sarah to ride a bike, debated politics with fierce intelligence, and baked legendary pies became someone who needed help with the most basic tasks. The vibrant personality was largely submerged. Yet, Sarah discovered, the love didn't vanish. It transformed. Loving Eleanor now meant loving the quiet woman who smiled vaguely at sunlight. It meant cherishing the rare, startling moments of clarity, however brief. It meant finding beauty in the simple act of holding her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the rhythm of her breath. It meant loving the essence that lingered beneath the confusion, the flickering light of a consciousness slowly dimming. One spring afternoon, Sarah sat beside Eleanor's bed. Her mother was asleep, her breathing shallow but even. Sunlight streamed through the window, dappling the bedspread. Sarah held Eleanor's thin hand, tracing the familiar veins. She thought of the burnt coffee, the forgotten photo, the terrifying night wanderings, the agonizing decision, the heartbreaking moments of lucidity. The grief was still there, a constant companion, heavy and profound. But intertwined with it now was a fierce, protective tenderness. She wasn't just mourning the loss, she was actively loving the person who was still here, even as she slipped further away. She was learning to say goodbye not with resignation, but with a presence that honored every fading spark. Sarah leaned close, her lips brushing her mother's papery forehead. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, the words thick with tears, yet utterly sincere. "More than all the coffee in the world. More than all the forgotten yesterdays." Eleanor didn't stir. There was no flicker of recognition in her sleeping face. But Sarah felt it, the quiet echo of a bond that transcended memory, a love that existed in the space between heartbeats, in the warmth of a held hand, in the unwavering act of showing up, day after day, to to love the person you are losing, even as you say goodbye 1,000 times before the final farewell. It was a love forged in the crucible of anticipatory grief, a love both heartbreaking and fiercely beautiful. The only way to truly love someone while losing them, piece by precious piece, before the goodbye finally comes.